We're diving into an unorthodox tuning or detuning method that's been floating around on the internet for a while, specifically about the snare drum that's supposed to get us a completely secondary sound in the blink of an eye, effectively giving us a second snare. We'll see. In an effort to help withhold judgment about exactly what's going on with the kit today, we are going to do things a little bit out of order. The first thing we want to give you is a little bit of context about the sounds that you're going to be hearing. We have one tension rod removed from the snare drum, deliberately away from the snare wires, and we're going to be testing out the capabilities of it with this setup. There are lots of hacks and tips and tricks out there that involve doing something to just one or two of the tension rods. This is a particularly extreme example because we're actually taking it all the way out, but we're also not touching any of the rest of them to try to make up for something. The intent here is to drop the pitch of the drum, get a fatter sound with less overtones, and also have a softer feel under the stick when we strike in the center. Let's hear what the results sound like in a groove. Okay, if we hadn't told you anything about what had been done to this drum, what would you have gleaned from hearing it in the context of that groove? Did it sound particularly unusual or like there was something decidedly wrong about how it's been set up? Did it sound out of tune or did it sound in tune? Particularly now thinking about what you expect out of a wide open drum with absolutely no muffling, did that feel like a lot of overtones or did it feel like the overtones were fairly controlled and fit into the context? Now that we've heard some context, let's do a back-to-back comparison of the drum by itself, first without the tension rod, and then with the tension rod replaced. Now that we heard the affected drum minus the tension rod first, this sounds like a pretty new sound, but it's also an expected sound out of a wide open drum with standard thickness heads and no muffling anywhere at all. The biggest and most obvious difference, of course, is that the pitch has gone up dramatically, which is pretty exciting considering that we only affected a single tension rod and I didn't touch any of the rest of them in the process of either sound. It is worth noting that if you have a drum that is constructed similar to this one with lugs that connect from the bottom to the top heads in one piece, you may have to make adjustments to the snare side tension rod once you've removed this one, since that will change at least a little bit. This is a wood drum, not so important, but it has die-cast hoops, which is actually very important for this particular experiment. A die-cast hoop is a lot stiffer than a triple flange, especially compared to thinner vintage triple flange hoops, so it's retaining a fair amount of tension even when we replace this tension rod. It wouldn't be surprising to discover if you own a drum with die-cast hoops that one day one of your tension rods has worked itself all the way loose just under normal playing conditions. Let's hear a little more of this drum minus the tension rod in context. I personally love both of the sounds that we're getting out of this snare drum. They feel distinct, they feel different enough for this to be a usable choice that I might make on a gig or a recording session. And most importantly, I didn't have to add or subtract anything special from the drum that I didn't already have. The cool thing about this is having a second sound that sounds really great right under your fingertips, that's always a good thing. Like, for instance, consider that we've been talking about the snare drum, but we actually also took a tension rod out of the 12-inch tom. And it sounds fantastic. It's actually one of the best low sounds we've ever gotten out of it. In fact, that's what you've been hearing this entire time. We took it out before we started recording at all. We actually did the same thing to the 16. Again, phenomenal. A little more controlled, a little more gated, minimal overtones, and a lot of attack at a very low tension. We also did it to the bass drum and discovered some sub-frequencies in there that we were not getting before that, frankly, I wasn't expecting. The complete statement here is that the entire drum set has had a single tension rod removed from every batter head with no adjustment after that. We just took them out and played them. And this is a perfect example of the physics of how having all of the tensions be the same gets you a positive result, but there's also positive results in deliberately unbalancing that tension, because if it's unbalanced, we can control overtones, sustain, and tone that way rather than adding mass to the head and slowing down the movement of the drums. Stick around to the end of the video for some context grooves back to back of the snare with the tension rod installed and with it removed so you can really hear that difference. Before we do that, we felt like we needed to do one more comparison because this is a die-cast drum. We need to know what happens if we do a triple flanged hoop instead. We're going to pull in the Supraphonic. We're going to do the exact same thing, just take the one tension rod out and see what that gets us. The effect on this drum is much more dramatic because of how much more flexible the hoop is itself. It's releasing a lot more tension at that location, and there's also a lot more harmonic content still coming out of the drum that's a little more dissonant, but almost in the vein of a distortion pedal on a guitar or something like that. We also experimented with which one to take out on this drum because the effect was more dramatic. And in the end, with the first drum, we chose one far away from the snare beds. And with the Supra, we actually took one out from right above the snare beds because it offered a better sound. It's worth noting again that with experimenting with the removal of tension rods, if you don't like what happened, you can put it right back in and none of the rest will have moved enough that you need to re-clear the head. Just listen to that one, match it, and you're back to square one. Now let's take a listen to single hits with the Supraphonic back-to-back with the tension rod out and then with the tension rod reinstalled. This is exhibiting a similar, pretty big jump in pitch from one to the next, and it is also tightening up tremendously in terms of the articulation when we go to the higher tuning, which is offset by how much more sustain there is in the overtones. These are both super usable sounds. I would, for this drum, think of the fully tensioned head as a slightly more traditional sound and the one removed as slightly more experimental because it is such a difference. But the feel and the sound overall is super interesting and super usable in both. Let's go ahead and listen to another demo of this drum with the tension rod removed in the context of the kit. In In talking about both the snare drums and also the rest of the kit, one of the main things that we're seeing here is sustain being diminished, but resonance not necessarily being diminished. This is a really different effect than trying to control the drums via some kind of muffling, because we're going to lose both in the process that way. By doing this, we're also not losing anything in terms of dynamic range. The drums are still very, very loud, and as you add mass to the heads or try to control them in another sort of way, we are limiting how loud the drums can get and also attenuating high frequencies that we may still want for attack. This goes for all the drums. It's very true of the toms as well. The way that the tone and the resonance is separated from the attack with these tunings sounds incredible, and we are still amazed that they aren't EQ'd in the audio that you're hearing. It's just raw sound. All right, we've made it this far. It's time for the promised back-to-back comparisons of the snare sounds, first without the tension rod and then with the tension rod reinstalled in the context of a groove. This experiment falls directly in line with our favorite experiments here, which is to say, it doesn't cost anything, it's quick, it's easy to undo if you don't like it, and it's going to have a slightly different effect on every drum you have, from a 12-inch tom to a kick to snares that have a different number of lugs on them. Every one of those is going to exhibit a different result. Even something as simple as moving from a 2-ply head to a 1-ply head will start you all over again in terms of what's possible. Anytime we can have an option in front of us that is fast, easy, replicatable, and easily undoable, that's a tool that we want to have at our disposal and in our brains when we're searching for sound. And something as simple as saying, I wish the snare drum was a little lower pitched right now. You don't have to do the whole thing. You could just take one out and see if it gets you something good, and if not, put it back. This is one of our experiments that we would really like to hear about, especially if you've tried this before, if it's worked for you, or if you're trying it because you're watching this video and you want to see what the results are going to be for you. Quick, easy, undoable, it's all there. Try it on every drum you have. If anything works, put that in your tool belt and get to work.